Good evening, everyone, and wherever you are joining us from, welcome and thank you for being here. Heri za Kwanzaa, happy Kwanzaa, as we are in the fourth day of our celebration. And so, if you haven't been with us from day one on Sunday, we started celebrating what community is. And then on day two, we talked about self determination and what that means, not only as an individual, but for we as a community, because certainly as a community, we should be thinking in terms of how are we going to define ourselves. And I know that we all are a part of many different communities, but I think Kwanzaa not only was designed for people to think about the Black or African American community here in America, but in keeping with uh, Dr. Moringa's, who is the founder and creator of Kwanzaa. This year's theme is practicing Kwanzaa and the seven principles, ensuring the well-being of the world. And so last evening was very exciting. They all have been, where we had our Chiefess Deb Harris uh, to lead us through a teaching and conversation about collective work and responsibility. So that is what we celebrated on this evening or last evening. And so this evening, we're here the fourth day of Kwanzaa to celebrate. I think if I had to choose one of the seven, one a favorite of all the 7 days, this certainly is one of my top favorite days. Ujamaa, where we talk about cooperative economics. And I can recall my first Kwanzaa celebration was about sixth or seventh grade, um, and learning about Kwanzaa economics, and I was thinking back on that today. That was a lot of thinking to go back all the way then to think about that. But thinking about the teachings that I had even then in elementary school, about uh, working, having a career, but also having the side hustle is what we would describe it as today. And I was thinking about, who were some of the first entrepreneurs that I knew that looked like me. And so today I'm remembering my Uncle Sonny, who owned the neighborhood corner convenience store. And and I'm thinking about a very special woman in my life who's been a mentor to me since I was in fourth or fifth grade, looking up to her. But she was a business owner, and she would uh, own one of Savannah's top rated restaurants, even before Paula Dean. And she is a proud Black woman, and I call her one of my other mothers. So when we talk about or think about cooperative economics, my uncle and this woman were a big part of the Black community, and they also gave back to the community. I can remember my uncle this time of the year giving food, and things for the house to people in the neighborhood who could not afford it. And my other mother to this day is still feeding the community and mostly now the elders of the community. And so we're here today celebrating cooperative economics. And at that point, when I learned about this in Kwanzaa, it was about the Black dollar and keeping it in our neighborhoods and supporting Black businesses and growing Black businesses. And but I think today, this evening, we're going to propose some other ways, some other examples of cooperative economics. And so, with that being said, I'm very pleased to bring on our resident facilitator. How are you, Sister Khara?
I am well. I'm excited to speak on this topic tonight.
We're excited to have you as our Kwanzaa leader for this evening. And first of all, happy Kwanzaa.
Happy Kwanzaa.
Is this one of your favorite days? Or do you have a favorite day so far?
That is a very hard question for me to answer just because, I have been literally, it's just blown away by every day of this Kwanzaa celebration. It's not something that we didn't grow up celebrating Kwanzaa. But it was always something that, my parents made sure we knew what it was. We read books about it, but this is one of my first full celebrations outside of joining in and watching along last year with our virtual celebration. But just hearing the different stories that are coming up every single day, and really seeing the connections between the symbols of Kwanzaa and each of the principles and how they are starting to build on each other is just completely like mind-blowing for me. So I'm just happy to be part of this.
Well, we're happy to have you back as our Kwanzaa leader, and I'm excited to hear how you connect, because you opened up our Kwanzaa celebration with Umoja and the talk about community. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing how we tie the community. How do we bring the community into or what community means to cooperative economics? What does cooperative economics mean to the community? And so, with that being said, please take us away.
All right, thank you. Well, as we've said, today's principle is Ujamaa, which we translate as cooperative economics. Through Ujamaa, we are committing as a Black community, but also as a broader community, to the building and maintaining of our own economic prosperity through stores, shops, and other businesses, and to the practice of shared social wealth. It's a promise that we as a people will profit from our businesses and our economics together. One of the things that struck me when I was reading about and just learning more about this principle was that when we think about Ujamaa, it's almost too easy to try and apply a Western perspective of wealth to this principle. But it's a very significantly different ideology. The difference between Western economics and the economic principle of Ujamaa is that Western economics tends to fall into that pitfall of capitalistic enterprise, where we say, I will accumulate wealth for myself because I deserve it, and the more I have, the more successful I am. Ujamaa, on the other hand, is a we principle. It's a collective and cooperative system of economics that's based in the original Swahili interpretation of the term. Ujamaa literally means familyhood. And that idea of familial economics says that we as a community are striving to maintain unity, umoja, and we will define ourselves in our community, kujichagulia, through the collective work and responsibility, Ujamaa, of building our community in a way that profits all of us, Ujamaa. Ujamaa suggests a better and a more equitable way of growing community and building society. It's one that shares wealth, one that works collaboratively, and one that understands that the opposite of communal and familial economics is economic exploitation, or the breeding ground for opposition, inequity, domination, and deprivation. Ujamaa is a long-standing principle in societies that thrive not on tribalism or nationalism or imperialism or the fruits of those systems, but in the concepts of brotherhood and sisterhood, the idea that you and I become who we are through each other, through community, and that we do that in unity. It calls for shared work and shared wealth, economic self-reliance in the building, strengthening, and controlling of the economics of our own community, and an obligation of generosity, particularly to the poor and the most vulnerable in our communities. It's often referenced closely with the legacy of President Julius Nyerere in Tanzania. And he used it as the basis of his social economic blueprint following the country's independence from Britain. President Nyerere believed that Ujamaa was what he called a commitment to the belief that there are more important things in life than the amassing of riches, and that if the pursuit of wealth clashes with things like human dignity and social equality, then the latter will be given priority. Now, I think some would make the argument that the eventual end of the Ujamaa project under President Nyerere would reflect a failure of the plan that he had for society. But I would argue with that, and I would say that what really was reflected in moving away from that system was not a failing of that system, but it was the resistance to the idea of communal change. It was the resistance to this new principle. Sorry. It was resistance to this new principle in deference to old systems and the failure to fully embrace the fullness of cooperative economics, which gives us both hope and warning that Ujamaa is a principle that works, but only if and when we are all in it together, with and for each other. I think that that's a very important distinction because we see the same thing happening in America, where we repeatedly call for what I would call individualistic capitalism and independence economics, the idea that everyone can pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, while failing to recognize the historical denial of even boots to the marginalized and socially and economically disenfranchised groups in our society. When we look at the collective buying power of the Black community in America today, it's often been noted that while we have over $1 trillion in annual spending power, our dollars leave our community within 6 hours. Maggie Anderson, who's an activist and co-founder of the Empowerment Experiment, noted that if we would increase spending within our own community from 2% to just 10%, we would create 1 million new jobs, both for our community and for the nation. Yet when we look at opportunities for economic development in Black communities, we're also forced, I think, to acknowledge America's historically racialized economic and business structures that leave even our own communities with little, if any, traditional avenues and opportunities for business development and economic growth. In a community like Flagstaff, it means recognizing the inequities that yield fewer opportunities for Black entrepreneurs to bring traditional brick and mortar businesses to our community. But it also means celebrating the creativity and the innovation in so many entrepreneurial efforts and small business incubators that build economic opportunities for underrepresented populations in our neighborhoods. and that add essential economic structures and sustainment to our entire community. I think of Miss Bernadine's reflection on cooperative economics in her life and how reflective that is of the significance of the Block, the neighborhood family in the Black community, the small stores and family businesses and familial bonds that saw communities of color caring for and sustaining each other despite economic barriers often put upon our communities. The small store owners who were like family, even though you didn't know them outside of stopping by for a dollar soda and a 25-cent bag of chips. And yet they were part of our family, and we looked out for each other in that neighborhood. It's something that I think we are missing today in so many of our neighborhoods, but it's not something that's impossible for us to get back to. We've noted a few times now that the 2021 Kwanzaa theme is ensuring the well-being of the world. We recognize that there are racialized inequities in American economics, represented in both income inequity and wealth inequity, which really are two different things, with wealth inequality creating a systemic spiral of economic immobility that spans for generations in the Black community. We recognize the consistently growing racial wealth gap that sees the typical white family with net worth equaling 8 times more than the typical Black family. Ujamaa calls for us as a Black community, but also today as an entire nation, to look at the historic inequities in economic opportunities, generational wealth, and so forth when it comes to the Black community as a whole. There was a recent report from the Center for American Progress in which researchers noted that the Black-white wealth gap in this country is not an accident, but the result of systemic deprivation. The report says, from the brutal exploitation of Africans during slavery to systemic oppression in the Jim Crow South, to today's institutionalized racism, apparent in disparate access to and outcomes in education, healthcare, jobs, housing, and criminal justice. Government policy has created or maintained hurdles for African Americans who attempt to build, maintain, and pass on wealth. Now, I know that reads as a pretty glaring indictment and an uncomfortable reality to confront as a nation in the midst of a celebration, but it is nevertheless our national truth that bears facing, even in the midst of the Kwanzaa celebration. Because we're not there yet, but it's our celebratory reminder of Imani, faith, which we are coming to towards the end of this celebration, which is the historical Black belief that we shall overcome. And we believe that that overcoming, even in economics, is coming. As Gary Cunningham, president and CEO of Prosperity Now, noted earlier this year, these historic inequities demand reckoning, acknowledgement, and atonement for a history that has went on since slavery to Jim Crow, to the great ripoff of the wealth of Black people in the mortgage crisis. And we now have to add, in this time of COVID, to even today's disparate impacts on Black communities still facing inequitable access to healthcare, jobs, economic development, and education, and more. We have a lot of work to do, which is a phrase that I know so many of us are probably tired of saying and tired of hearing. But we do. We have a lot of work to do, both as a Black community and as a nation. This work calls for all hands on deck, for every person to be seen as part of our whole, not as individuals, not hands out, but hands in. And most of all, it calls for hope. We can face economic, social, and other disparities with hope because we know that we collectively are a people of creative innovation, of making a way out of no way, of clinging to hope in the midst of despair, and turning what was meant to destroy even America's systemic networks of oppression into beauty and good for us and for all. With that, I'm going to turn the conversation over and bring in another speaker tonight to talk more about the different methods that we have for cooperative economics in our country, and that is Dr. Coral Evans.
Well, hello, Ms. House.
Hello, welcome.
I really appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight, to have this conversation with you and the rest of our viewers. The concept about cooperative economics. I had the opportunity to speak with a few people earlier this week, and someone said something that I thought was really interesting. They said that the concept of cooperative economics sounds scary, right? It sounds scary. And I asked why. And the conversation went to, well, it seems to be an us against them type of a thing. And so I wanted to start my remarks out with that conversation. And the conversation that we hear a lot that talks about having a seat at the table or making room at the table, and whether or not there's enough room for everyone at the table. And I want to say that I believe that in this country, we have been led astray, and we've been led to believe that there's not enough for everybody, that there is somehow a cap or a limit on the possibilities, on the dreams, on the fulfillment of dreams for all of us. Somehow we have allowed ourselves to be drugged down into what I call a poverty mindset. When you look at the table and when we talk about making room for everybody at the table, I think it's important for us to realize that, for example, when my family comes to the table, my daughter is lactose intolerant. So she's not going to be after the milk that's on the table. Some people are gluten intolerant, so they're not going to be interested in that. Some people are maybe allergic to apples or whatnot, right? So, really, it's for all of us to be at the table and to see what's on the table and to be like, hey, your family needs this. I have a personal need for that. Those individuals over there need that. There is truly enough for us all. I think that that's reflective in nature as well. I have never seen an apple tree produce one apple, at least not here in Flagstaff. When you see in the summertime, the apple trees, the branches are breaking because there's so many apples on it. The same thing with sunflowers. You've never seen a field that has one sunflower in it. There's usually hundreds, if not thousands. So I want to encourage us to get out of this poverty mindset, that there is not enough opportunity, that there is not enough capacity in a country such as the United States, that we all cannot thrive in the way that we would like to thrive. And everybody's vision or dream looks completely different for those individuals. When we talk about cooperative economics, we also tend to focus just on one thing, right? Economics, like Ms. House said, we tend to really focus on the money. And without a doubt, that's important, right? We need money to pay our bills. We need money to live. We need money to eat. But I also want us to kind of broaden that and look at other forms of currency that we all have that is exactly the same. It doesn't matter if you are a millionaire or a billionaire, or if you're living below the poverty line. Something that we all have that is equitable to cash is our time, right? We all have 24 hours in a day. And so I want to encourage us to look at how do we spend our time and where do we spend our time and what does our time mean to us? Are we spending our time on things that are not producing anything for ourselves, anything for our community, anything for our families? Or are we using our time in a way that actually allows us as individuals, us as families, move forward? I also think it's important that we look at the fact that a lot of times when we say cooperative economics, we're like, okay, that means shop local. That means so much more than just shop local. Without a doubt, we need to be shopping local and we need to be supporting our local small businesses. A lot of businesses now across the United States are woke, right? And so, they might have a certain ad or a certain slogan or a certain flag outside, but it's really up to us before we spend money at those businesses to see if their actions are matching what they're saying, right? So how woke are they, and how does that relate to what you see when you go into that facility? Who do you see working there? What are their principles? What are their corporate giving guidelines, and who do they give to as corporations, right? Also, it means that we need to be involved in our community. The Southside has a slogan: "Are you a part of this community, or do you just live here?" Right? Is this a place where you just come home and you go to sleep, or is this a community that you're actually a part of? Being a part of that community is making sure that you know your neighbors. It's going to, the local block watch. It is making sure that you are helping to pick up the trash on the side of the road. It's making sure that you're volunteering within your community. It's also making sure that you're voting, because that's something that's just as important. And it's interesting too, because when we talk about cooperative economics, one of the things that we never talk about, for example, is something that we are all a part of, no matter where you live in this country. We all pay some form of taxes. So I, for example, can't afford my own fire truck. I'm not sure how many of you out there could buy your own fire truck. But what happens, at least at the municipal level, is we pay certain taxes, and that goes into a pot. And that allows us to have things like a fire department, a police department, the libraries, the parks, things like that. And so one of the things that we need to do, and one of the things that's really important when it comes to being local and cooperative economics, is making sure that you're showing up to things like budget retreats that your council has, that you're weighing in on the state budget when you have the opportunity, about how do you want the monies, this cooperative pot of monies, how do you want that to be spent? Here in the state of Arizona, we currently spend more money on our private prison systems our private prison system than we do our 3 institutions of higher learning. Is that something that we're okay with? Don't forget, we all paid into this pot, a pot of money. So I really wanted to, share those thoughts with you all when it comes to cooperative economics and what we can do to make sure that we are not just shopping local, but we're actually part of this community, and we're weighing in, and we're spending our time wisely, and we're spending our time where it comes back to us. And that we understand that cooperative economics is based in a concept of thrivability, and it's not based in one that is a poverty mindset. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I loved the analogy you shared of the apple tree and the sunflower field, and just how, the fruits of our community are never just one item, one person. It's all of us working together. I think that's so important. And I kept going back to that focus on it not being a poverty mindset, and being more than just money and that form of wealth distribution. I feel like something else that our society fears so much when it comes to concepts like this is that fear of wealth distribution, and that idea that, you're going to take my money and just give it to other people who aren't willing to build themselves up, or who can't get there. And I was reading earlier an article that was talking about, we have that fear, and we have folks that are saying, that's all this is. That's all you're talking about. You want to just take my money and give it to somebody else, and that's not fair. And what this article was saying, it was written by economists who were talking about this principle. And they said that even if we were to start our system fresh and give equal wealth distribution to everyone, and everybody just starts as economic equals, we would see the system of disparity and the wealth gap quickly resume itself, because the issue goes so much deeper than just money. It's an entire system that's been built on this principle of not letting certain people thrive so that others can maintain wealth or maintain more of that economics. So it runs deeper than just an issue of money. And I just think all of that is so interesting and important. And when we get to the real heart of this, like you said, it's not just about money, it's about family. We're looking at community as being a family, and as being all of us in this together, that if one person is floundering or failing, our entire community is about to collapse. because of that one. Do
Is
you?
it, sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I just got really excited when you said that. I grew up playing ice hockey on an all boys team. And I'll never forget one of the things that the coach always told us was that our team is only as good as our weakest player,
Mhm.
right? Because you can't have the first string out on the ice for the full game. They got to come off, right? They have to have a rest. So your team is only as strong as your weakest player. One of the things when I was in office, I would say is our community is only as strong as our weakest neighborhood. I think it's really important. I myself own a small business, right? And I want as many people as possible to buy stuff from me. In order for them to buy stuff from my small business, they also have to have some type of money, right? They have to have some type of really disposable income because, what I sell is considered probably like, a little gifty this, a little gifty that. It's not an immediate need type of a thing. And so when you really look at the concept of cooperative economics, it benefits all of us. If I have the opportunity to help somebody start their small business, which I do, I moonlight at a small incubator. If I have the opportunity to show somebody how they could make more money, that's going to come back in my community in some way. That person might spend money with you, who spends money with somebody else, and then that person come back and buy something from my shop, right? It's a circular type of pattern. The more people that are thriving and the more people that are successful, the more monies will be out there to assist with everybody,
Mhm.
right? And I just think it's important for us to really understand that.
Yeah. With you bringing up part timing at a small business incubator, I want us to talk about the market of dreams and really how that is a representation of cooperative economics for the Flagstaff community. Um, I don't know if I make the assumption that most people know what the market of dreams is and how that works. But can you explain just how that functions to not only develop those small business owners, but how it also then is feeding back into the community where it sits and the broader Flagstaff community?
Yeah, I would love to. So, I had the opportunity. So, with the Sunnyside Neighborhood Association of Flagstaff, they partnered with NACED. NACED is the incubator that's up on top of the hill, now known as Moonshot, and did a study in the Sunnyside neighborhood area about small business and helping other people start their small business. And what does that look like, especially in a community that's considered to be impoverished, right? And so what we found was a lot of individuals were doing things. Miss Reverend Lewis mentioned a side hustle. There was a lot of people doing stuff, and they were making money on the side, or they were trying to make money on the side, but they didn't necessarily have all the tools that they needed. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Geronimo Vasquez, Supervisor Vasquez, supervisor for Coconino County District 2, was heavily involved with this as well. And this was actually a brainchild of the two of us over a cup of coffee. So the Market of Dreams came to being. And what it is, it's a micro entrepreneurship center that works very specifically for people who are low income. And it provides a cooperative retail space for them. So, you might not be able to afford a storefront. This individual might not be able to afford one, but together they have a storefront. Everyone volunteers 3 hours a week to keep the storefront open. And so they're selling everybody's stuff so they know everybody's story within the store. They also get assistance with, small business development, the micro loans, the $250 that someone might need to go through like restaurant licensing. They get assistance with learning how to purchase the packaging for their items, how to package it, how to make sure that their presence on Facebook is a certain way. Everything to do with business, right? Business entrepreneurship classes. We're pretty excited. We've had some major successes with the Market of Dreams. One is the Tres Amigos, the taco truck that is there in the corner. They've actually opened their second location. And so it's about everybody pooling their time and resources and thoughts together to make this work, right? It's about partnering. It's about making sure that we're buying stuff locally. The Market of Dreams was originally located on 7th Avenue in the shopping center where Cal Ranch was. We have recently vacated that spot. And so you all can look for us to open in a brand new location right behind Fratelli's on 4th Street. I'm really, really excited about that. We're currently in the process of redoing that location. But an example right here in Flagstaff of cooperative economics, of bringing people together, of wrapping a community around this activity. And this is something that was not just, like I said, something that, myself and Head Animal sat down and came up with this idea, but it was something that was vetted locally by our other incubator. And it's based off of some ideas that happened in other places throughout the United States. One of the examples we point back to is Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley was not always one of the richest places in the world. What happened is you had some entrepreneurs that were there that had an idea. And then you had a community around them that supported them while they were trying to grow this idea, right? And before you know it, their idea, lit on fire. And so then what you have is you have now businesses that have sprung up around those ideas. You have the local PTA. If they need something, there's money there. The local basketball league or the soccer league, if they need jerseys or something, there's businesses there. There's jobs there for the people in the community. And so this is what we're trying to do, and we've been very successful at here in Flagstaff.
That's amazing. I was watching on social media as the market was moving, and I think that's something else that we forget about. And you brought up earlier in terms of cooperative economics being more than just money, but it's also time and sharing of resources. And that was something that really stood out to me when it was moving, just the call out to the community to partner in helping to tear things down or move things over to the new place, and how responsive the community seemed to be to that. And just realizing and just wishing that you could just kind of shake an entire city to say, this is what happens when we engage in cooperative economics. We are all part of this. We see the benefit of this incubator for our community, but we also see what happens when we see these business owners as not just, titans of industry or people seeking money, but members of our community family. I'm helping to move my family. And that's something that feels so at once native to our thinking process, but also so foreign when we start talking about economics. We don't think that it applies that same way, and yet we're living it here in Flagstaff. So it's just the strange kind of mental divide, I think, that we experience, that if we could just recognize that this is what we're doing and this is what happens when we do it, we'd be so much better off.
Yeah, I think, that's really important. First of all, definitely a shout out to the volunteers that helped us move the market. If you can imagine a full incubator, a full retail space, a computer lab, 2 kitchens, a bookstore, everything that's within the walls of the market, the patio. And for us to start at 8 o'clock in the morning and for us to be done moving at 2, it definitely took the community to come out to do that. And the community showed up. The same thing inside with some of the demolition that was going on inside the building. And so we greatly appreciate that. I think it's also something that you hit on that a lot of us don't think about. We always think about the big corporations. The majority of us work for a small business. The majority of people in the United States, the majority of people in Flagstaff, in the state of Arizona, work for a small business. And a small business is not some business that is under 500 people. We're talking about a business that has 5 people, 10 people, 25 people, under 50 people. And so I think that it's really important for us to understand that. Sometimes we use the word business, right? And we sometimes give business a bad connotation. And I want to make sure that we understand that that is really not the case. Business is important. It's a way of life. Like I said, I'm a small business owner. It's what we're doing with those businesses, how we're interacting with those businesses, and what those businesses mean to our community and what they're doing for our community, right? And there's some businesses that are great with that, and there's some businesses that are not so great. And that's when I go back to okay, where do we spend our money? How do we spend our money? Right? And collectively, how we spend our money has great impact. And we shall be mindful of that. But then number two, at the end of the day, we have currency, quite frankly, that is just as, if not even more important, and that is our time. That's how we utilize our time. That's how we spend our time. That's what we do with our time, you know? And so I really think we need to be mindful about that, especially moving forward into this new year. What are we going to do with our time that's going to bring back benefits to ourselves, to our family, and to our community?
That's great. Thank you so much. I want to invite Miss Bernadine back in case we have audience questions. Um, but I also want to just take an opportunity and ask you, we had the question last night to Miss Deb about, what kept her so passionate and so engaged. And uh, I know, I think probably very little of the history of your engagement in Flagstaff. I know some of the different agencies that you worked with, and of course, I know your history as the mayor and now working with Senator Kelly. Um, but I think what stands out to me is how engaged you managed to stay as part of the community. You are a mayor and a now doctorate student or recipient of your doctorate degree. And you're doing all of these other things, and yet you're still making time to be part of the Market of Dreams, the Live Black Experience Project, Southside Community Association, all of these smaller things that are very time consuming. And I'm curious to know, what keeps you so passionate about these seemingly smaller things that are feeding back into the community? Why is that so important to you to still be part of?
So it's interesting, I was definitely listening when you asked Miss Deb that question last night. And so I like to tell stories. So I'm going to try to make this story brief. But I think this story probably showcases why I'm so committed to my community and why I love my community. So this story is about a lady. Okay. She was a single mom, and she lived here in Flagstaff with her two kids. She had been originally a school teacher, but she slipped and fell and she broke her back. And so she was unable to work, so she was disabled. And she moved back here to Flagstaff because she's originally from Flagstaff. And she ended up in Siler Homes. It's a housing project that's on the east side of town. And this lady was a single mom with two kids, very little income. And the community seemed to see value in that lady and value in those two kids. And so those two kids had the opportunity to go to a private school. They got to go to summer camps, do ballet. They got to sing in a choir. They got to play soccer. They got to play other sports here in town. And when those two kids grew up, um, one of those kids went on to become a doctor, a medical doctor, and started helping people with their health. The other one went on and had the opportunity to teach GED, adult education, and ESOL. Had the opportunity to work with several nonprofits, and at the end of the day, had the opportunity to be mayor of the city of Flagstaff, Arizona. And that's really me trying to kind of condense my story. But really, the reason why I give back to my community in the way that I do is because my community saw something in my mom and her two kids. Um, and we truly are like kids from the village. I mean, I had the opportunity to grow up playing ice hockey, one of the most expensive sports in the world, right? I had the opportunity to play ice hockey from the time I was 4 to the time I was 19. I did ballet. I sung in a choir. I played soccer. I went to a couple different private schools. Had the opportunity to be at Museum of Northern Arizona and on the Eldon Pueblo archaeology digs, things like that. I had one hell of a childhood here. And it's only because of the community that was here that saw value in my mom and my twin brother and myself. And so being the kid that the community raised, I feel like, as Miss Deb said, to who much is given, much is expected, right? And I do it out of love. I 100% love this community. And so I hope that answers the question.
It does.
I feel very grateful to be from Flagstaff and to live here and to be a part of this community.
All right. Miss Bernadine, we want to invite you back if there are other audience questions or if you have questions for either of us or.
You know, to bring this to an end, first of all, I've heard, we all have heard the build of community, self-determination, collective work and responsibility, and now cooperative economics. Um, in bringing cooperative economics, the celebration of it um, to a pause, because the celebration continues. I want to talk a little bit about why Black dollars matter, because um, I can remember going into business in the South, where eventually I had to, through a little bit of disappointment and heartbreak, but because I needed for the business to survive, to say, well, I'm a Black woman, I'm an African woman living in America doing business. Um, and I've oftentimes felt very guilty about that. Um, but I want us to talk about why it is important for everyone, no matter what cultural identity you may have, why the Black dollar matters, because certainly, whether it is known or not, um, the three of us on the screen hold most of the uh, power, financial power in this United States. But yet, and we talk about it quite often during our community dialogues, we're still significantly behind. But our dollars, when we add it up, we are buying, we are consumers in the American economy, but we're also business owners as well. So I'm wondering if each of you could speak to that, why the Black dollar matters to everyone.
Well, I can jump in and say I had the opportunity, I want to say it was maybe 2 years ago, Reverend Lewis, to speak very specifically about the value of the Black dollar. As Ms. House mentioned, here in the United States, African American Black people, our gross domestic product, our value is over $1 trillion. And you hit it on the head when you said we are consumers, right? We consume a lot. I think as African Americans, as Black people, we need to ask what we are getting for our consumption, right? We need to really sit back and say, what are we getting? One of the things I said, that when you go to a business to spend money, right? Especially nowadays, because everybody's woke. Everybody, okay? You see different colored flags, you see different people in ads, you see a whole bunch of stuff going on. But it's one thing to act like you're woke, and it's another thing to actually be woke. So it's like when you go in that business, what do you actually see their actions saying? Who do you actually see working there? And what positions do you see people working there? What is their corporate giving structure like? Who are they giving money to? Are they giving money to the small nonprofits that are actually doing the grassroots work? Or are they giving money to, maybe bigger organizations for a photo op? I think some of that, comes back on us as Black people, right? Um, Definitely there is an income disparity. Definitely there is a high level of poverty. But to be very blunt, some African Americans make very good money, and collectively we are spending over $1 trillion. So I think that that's part of us stepping back and saying, do I really need that? Do I really need that purse? Do I really need that latte? Do I really need this new dress? I think 3 years ago when I estimated here in Arizona, there was something like 420,000 African American of people who identify with being African American. If you take that in half, you have a 240,000. If all the people that were 240,000, the 240,000 of us were to take $25 a month and put it together, this conversation about small businesses having the money to start up, we could actually give small business loans to African Americans. When you're talking about being able to buy a house and not having having the down payment for the house, talk about teachers, talk about getting medical students through medical school. Definitely society overall needs to address the issue that we have here in this country, but also we as African Americans need to stop and look at the power that we have. And that's why I go back to, we have power. We have privilege. There's a whole conversation that we've had several times about this concept of privilege. I feel that we all have privilege. The fact that we're on the screen having this conversation tonight shows that we have a certain sense of privilege. We need to then look at how we are spending our monies as Black people, and we need to spend them accordingly or not, right? And that's part of this, or not. Just stop and think. At $1 trillion, what if every Black person in America, or anybody who identifies as being Black, and I'm going to broaden this, anybody who thinks that there's an issue with the way African Americans have been treated, right? So this is everybody. Everybody could participate in this. What if we all just didn't spend money for a day? What if we didn't spend money for a week? I think that there would be a different conversation about maybe voter rights and all sorts of other stuff happening. But as long as we continue with business as usual, then you're going to, in some sense, get business as usual. And so I think it's really us talking about, how do we spend our money? First of all, recognizing our power, recognizing our privilege, and talking about how do we spend our money. I talked about the investment of time. Some of that is doing a Google search to find out, what is this corporation's giving policy? What is their diversity policy? Who works for this corporation, and what do they look like, right? We could be spending some time on that. And so those are the ideas that I have about that. Some of this is up to us to help correct.
I was listening to that and I got so caught up in what you were saying, Dr. Evans, I forgot half of the answer I was going to give. But besides saying, ditto and just yes to all of what you said, I do think that when it comes to Black economics in particular in this country and the power of the Black dollar, it is important for us to realize both our own power within the Black community and for a broader recognition of the limitations that have been put on that power, so that we can see what would happen if we simply embrace that self-definition and the ability of ourselves to determine how far our power goes, to say, I'm not going to let that be a limitation anymore. We have over $1 trillion in spending power. We make up 14% of the country approximately, but apparently maintain 4% of the economic wealth in this country. And yet we have $1 trillion of buying power. there are systemic disparities that are happening between those numbers that don't make sense unless we are continuing to embrace the systems that made that possible. If we would really look at where our money is going and recognize when or what happens when we're putting that money outside of our own communities, when we're being self-invested, and saying, I know my neighborhood is suffering, but I really want this thing for me. I deserve this. That's buying into, I think, that same, I keep using the term capitalistic system, and I know that's a harder term for some people to hear because it sounds like, oh, then you're against our system of government in this country. And that's not what I'm saying at all. But I am saying that there are discrepancies and disparities that have been built into those systems that keep us in that mindset of all for me, even if it means nothing for you. And if we would really look at what that system is doing to our communities, that is part of what's keeping our communities from being able to advance. Versus if we were able to say, I'm growing myself, I'm building myself up because I'm bringing others with me. I'm accumulating wealth because it means that I have a legacy to leave. This is not just money that I'm planning to carry with myself to my grave. It's because I have intention of using this to build up my community. It's going back into, I grow so that we grow. I am gaining so that we all can gain, and recognizing that connectiveness between us all to know that, again, if there is one in this society, in this community, in my household who is suffering, then we're all suffering. It's a very shaky ground that we stand on when we think only for ourselves, because when every single person is thinking only for themselves, there is no solid foundation that we're all growing on. Versus if we're able to think more collectively and recognize that power of the Black community that has been historically denied access and opportunity and economic growth and development and all of these things. If we as a broader society would recognize the need to incorporate the Black community into American economics, to incorporate the other disenfranchised or socially disadvantaged communities into a broader sense of our economic and social development as a country, we would be light years ahead of where we are right now. So that to me is the importance of the Black dollar, that as we recognize the power of our dollars ourselves, we're able to bolster our own community. As the nation recognizes the value of our dollar, they're able to bolster the entire nation in saying, I'm not going to keep disregarding this $1 just because Joe Schmo down the street has 100 more that are more important to me. It's all part of the same system. So let's recognize it all with equal value and see that what we're doing for the least, we're doing for all.
And I think that goes back to this concept of a poverty mindset that we somehow have all bought into, right? First of all, here in the United States, we don't practice a pure form of capitalism anyway. Okay, I think that that's something that's really important for us to just kind of throw out there. Okay, because if we were truly practicing that, then we wouldn't really be having this conversation. Because the idea is that the more people who have more money, then that means more money actually for me. So we're not actually practicing the pure form, but maybe that's a different discussion that we'll have at a different day. But I think it ties back to this poverty mindset, right? That we have somehow been led to believe that there is not enough out there. So we need to make sure that we grab on the ours and we're not going to share it because there's not enough for everybody. And then I go back and I say, if you just look at nature and what nature reflects to us, that is not the case, right? That is obviously not the case. That is not how this works. I also wanted to just point out that, Khara, Miss House, you mentioned something that I think is really what we need to get back to, or something we should consider. Myself and Reverend Lewis was talking about this the other day. I'm going to bring up, the hot lunch program or the hot breakfast program that were for kiddos, right? How did that first start? There's this sense that maybe the government needs to do all this stuff. And I'm like, the government can only do so much, right? And depending on what level the government is at, it takes forever to get something done, right? Okay, so if we're waiting for someone else, we are the people that we've been waiting for. And so, I go back to the example. There was a group of individuals that recognized in this particular neighborhood that these kids needed to have a hot breakfast. They started that program. Now that program is, almost in every school, right? But who started that program? The
The
Black
Black
Panthers.
Panthers.
Panthers started that program, right? And so, when we talk about cooperative economics, I shared my story with you. I think that my life is an example of cooperative economics, right? A whole bunch of people were doing a whole bunch of stuff at some level to make sure that me and my brother grew up to be the citizens that we are. And I want to say that I feel that if we were to add up everything they spent, on myself and my brother to get us to where we are today, that was one hell of an investment. And I want to say that money has been returned to the community at least tenfold, right? I mean, I don't know how many people's lives my brother has saved, but I think, if we're just going with him, I think we've been returned tenfold. So I go back again and I say that you're right in saying that it's not just ethnic people, Black people, Indigenous people that need to really grow in our who we are and the impact that we have and the amount of influence that we have, but it's also other people recognizing that, hey, if there was less poor people and more people had money, they might actually spend it with me, right? But I also think that starts with us and understanding how we spend our money, where we spend our money, and what is our money doing? Is our money furthering this cause? Is it furthering the principles of Kwanzaa? Is it furthering, equality? Or is it just being spent?
Yeah. And I know we have to close. I knew that this topic would take us over because it is what makes the world go round. It is what keeps our communities um, thriving. And so, to my other family, and then this, when I say other, to my European American brothers and sisters, to my indigenous brothers and sisters, to my Latina brothers and sisters, I would like to put a challenge out there. We say, most of us say and agree that Black lives do matter. They should matter not when someone is assassinated in the streets or in their car or on the playground. Um, it should matter also while we are here, present today, living, trying to be productive citizens of these United States. And if a community is happy and thriving and has playgrounds and a community center and hot meals when mom and dad are away at work, and people in the community to help tutor and help with homework, because we are a village, and it does really take that village. That's what you're talking about, Dr. Coral. Then also what has to be included in that is that if you put some money into the other communities, we'll go to Target, we'll go to Big Lots, we'll go to the dollar store. Um, these the three these are the three places that are typically where ethnic people will go, as well as European Americans, and we'll go to Walmart. Well, today I discovered, and that's what I was doing, uh, both of you prior to coming on live, I was still looking at Black businesses who manufacture and retail home good items. And today alone, I found 60 Black businesses that manufacture clothing, clothes detergent, that make bedding, that make dish detergent, sanitizing products for the home that are natural and safe, not full of chemicals. So I'd like to put a challenge out there. I'd like for the LBE, I'd like for us to put a list out there for our community to have access to. And let's challenge ourselves for the next few months, because Kwanzaa is for 12 months. We just take 7 days to recognize it, but Kwanzaa is 365 days that we should be working, acknowledging all of these 7 principles. So let's put a challenge out there to let's support some Black businesses. We all need toilet. I found a toilet tissue manufacturer and retailer, paper towel. So those things that we typically need to run to Walmart or Target real quick to pick up are out there, made by people of African descent. And so this is what cooperative economics is all about, because I promise you that if a mom, and I knew a lot of moms who were selling homemade cookies and baking cakes and sweet potato pies to help buy school clothes and to help buy books for their children to read. I promise you that those kids were not the ones that were on the streets or caught up in the street drama. We're talking about cooperative economics. So if we want to not have to cry and go through over and over again when we hear about a Black life being taken senselessly, then it takes cooperative economics and it takes community. So I'd like to put that challenge out there for all of us, but particularly for we as people of African descent. It is more of a responsibility for us. But if we're thinking collectively, then it is more of a responsibility for all of us. And that is the theme for this year's Kwanzaa, that we are about making the world, the well-being of the world better. So with that being said, blessed are you, two beautiful sisters, two women of might. Blessed are our viewers who thought it not robbery to give us time and to join us in this Kwanzaa celebration. And with that, this evening, we are so grateful to be able to light the candle of cooperative economics, Ujamaa. And so tomorrow we will be back. This is just a simple pause. Please, community, thank you for being with us this evening. Please come back tomorrow. But until then, go and live in grace.